Nick Saban makes his SEC championship game prediction, and I think he's wrong, and I think I know why.
You are Locked On College Football, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football live from SEC Media Days. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your daily source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth. Realignment, coaching carousel, the portal, and more. Getting you ready for the season. We've always got you covered. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Very special guest coming up on today's show. Jordan Rogers of SEC Network and ESPN will be on this very program talking about the prediction that Nick Saban made and so much more. And we'll talk about how ready Oklahoma is. Brent Venables feels good going into the SEC. Are they as ready as they need to be in 2024? Jay Smith of Locked On Sooners will join me. But Nick Saban had a quote flying around that he thinks that Texas and Georgia will meet in the SEC championship game. Now, on an immediate reaction standpoint, it's not a crazy take because those are both playoff caliber teams. Those are two of the betting favorites in the SEC. Georgia, of course, the betting favorite and the national championship favorite going into this year. What I think Saban misses is how difficult both of these schedules are and the fact that these teams play each other. But part of the reason that this prediction came about, I think, is because Saban is new to the pundit game. He was coaching a college football semifinal game just about 6 months ago. Kind of crazy to think it's been 6 months, but that's where we're at. So when you look at what you're trying to accomplish, if you're Nick Saban, sliding over into a pundit's chair, do you want to project an image of, I'm just here to pump up Alabama? No, probably not. I think that's why Alabama was not in this prediction. Now, Alabama has a difficult schedule as well, but the schedule component is why I do not see Georgia and Texas playing in the SEC championship game. My instinct, not making a prediction just yet, it's still July, predictions are for August. My instinct is to go with Georgia. I think I like Georgia's team more than Texas. I like Texas's schedule more than I like Georgia's. But these two teams have too difficult of schedules combined for them to both meet in the SEC championship game. Because I'm presuming, reasonably so, given the past history of the SEC title game, that in conference play, you're going to have a pair of 1 or 0 loss teams getting to the SEC championship. Now, Texas's big break on their schedule is that they do not play Alabama and they do not play Ole Miss. Georgia has to play on the road against both of those teams, and they have to go to Austin and play Texas. They've got to host Tennessee, but I struggle picking against Georgia at home ever, and FanDuel has that line around 17 points in favor of the Bulldogs. So at least one of these teams is going to have one loss, which means for them to meet in the SEC championship game, whichever team loses Georgia-Texas on October 19th at Texas Memorial Stadium, the other team has to play the rest of their SEC schedule perfect. And I think that's asking far too much. Because as good as these teams are, either one could make a run at the national championship this year, particularly the Bulldogs. But certainly Texas is in that camp as well with the way they have reloaded in the transfer portal this offseason. They lost a lot, which is why I feel that Georgia has the superior roster, but I also like Kirby Smart more than Steve Sarkisian. I think Sark's stock is on the rise, but you give me the coach that I prefer, the roster that I prefer, the quarterback that I'd slightly take over Quinn Ewers. I like Quinn. I'd take Carson Beck if I had to choose between the two, whether you're talking NFL or college prospects. So I want to go towards Georgia there, but then they have to play at Ole Miss. They have to play at, like, if Georgia had a more reasonable schedule, their win total on FanDuel would probably be 11.5. I think the only reason it is 10.5 is expecting them or thinking that they're going to go undefeated in the 3 games that are at Alabama, at Texas, and at Ole Miss, I think is a big ask even for the Bulldogs. If they do win all those games and they go 12-0, they're going to roll to the national championship. Because if they're capable of winning all 3 of those games, I don't think anybody's going to be able to knock them off. So that's what Saban, I think, misses. The Alabama component, I think, was 100% in play, because Alabama, the more I think about it, is a team that I'm picking to make the SEC championship game. Kalen DeBoer took the stage earlier today at SEC Media Days, and it's a crazy thing to hear said aloud. Kalen DeBoer has coached in his career 116 college football games as a head coach. He's lost 12. He's lost 12. He wins, and he wins immediately everywhere he goes. Was there roster turnover when he got to Tuscaloosa? Yeah, there was. Have you noticed what they've done in the transfer portal? Because they have added a litany of players that are going to make an impact. They have a great recruiting class coming in with some true freshmen like Ryan Williams, a 5-star plus wide receiver, who can be impact players for them in 2024. You've got a returning quarterback as well. I think with Kalen DeBoer, Jalen Milroe could have the best season of his career. And I think Saban wanted to avoid, and I think it's a tactical move. If you're thinking about how to further your career as a pundit, how to be the best in your new role, it was probably the right decision for him to not get on there and pick Alabama. If he didn't feel like dealing with the blowback, look, Nick Saban's been in the public eye for a long time. He's taken plenty of criticism and shots, but he's done that as a head coach. He hasn't done that as a pundit yet. So I think it's a soft landing sort of pick to pick 2 teams that are going to be among the preseason favorites in Texas and Georgia. But to not pick Alabama, look, Ole Miss could wind up in the championship game. I wouldn't be completely shocked, though perhaps a little surprised, just because I don't expect to make that selection, if LSU were to wind up in the conference championship game. But Texas, if they lose that game at home against Georgia, they then have to beat both Texas A&M on the road last week of the regular season. Chris Gordy, Locked On SEC, thinks Texas A&M is going to win that game. It's possible. Big-time rivalry. Mike Elko is going to be able to do more with the talent Texas A&M has than Jimbo Fisher ever did. But they also have Red River. And we're going to talk about Oklahoma later in today's show. Texas has that Michigan game early in the season, but that doesn't pertain to what happens in regards to the SEC championship. That doesn't affect that at all because it's a non-conference game. But if they lose that game against Georgia, to say they're going to beat Oklahoma and win at Texas A&M, look, those are both challenging games that Texas is capable of winning, but neither one is a true home game. So that Georgia game may very well determine whether Texas gets the SEC championship game. And if they do win, and they are able to knock off either Oklahoma or Texas A&M, I think they'll run the table on the rest of their schedule just fine in the SEC slate. Mississippi State, Vanderbilt, like Florida's at home. They're at Arkansas, hosting Kentucky. It's a much more manageable schedule than what Georgia has. But if Georgia loses that game at Texas, they still have to play at Ole Miss. And they're playing Alabama on September 28th. Those are all incredibly losable games. So that's why I think Nick Saban is wrong, and why I think his diversion from picking Alabama is just because he's newer in the role. I don't think he can look at Alabama's team knowing what he left behind and feel, I don't know if they're going to make the conference championship game. They might not. Those would be 3 teams that I definitely have near the top of my list to make the SEC championship game. But both Georgia and Texas getting there, I think the schedules are just too tough, because whoever loses their matchup will have to be perfect in the rest of their SEC schedule, and I think they have too many difficult games to accomplish that. Let me know your thoughts in the YouTube comments, or hit me up on X, formerly known as Twitter. Very special guest coming up next. Jordan Rogers, ESPN, SEC Network. What does he think about Georgia and Texas matching up? Had a great interview, and we'll get to it after this. First, this episode is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. I love sports, and I love them so much that I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games, and the sports aren't sportsing like I always want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want, which is really, really nice of them. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. They've got everything you could possibly want to bet on for college football. Win totals, individual games. Every Week 0, Week 1 game can be wagered upon, or at least the betting line can be viewed. by you yourself over at FanDuel. And this summer, FanDuel's hooking up all customers with a boost or bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Open Championship, college football, everything you want, it's there. Head over to FanDuel.com. Start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Jordan Rogers, ESPN SEC Network, joining me here on the show. Jordan, appreciate you taking the time. I want your reaction to Nick Saban's SEC championship game prediction. Texas and Georgia. Do you think he's right?
Actually, that's the first time I'm hearing that. I think that's a good prediction. I would go Georgia Ole Miss. I'm really high and bullish on Ole Miss. Not just the talent that they have on offense returning. Juice Wells coming over from South Carolina 2 years ago. He was one of the best receivers in the SEC. But defensively, what they added, I think is finally going to allow this Ole Miss team to be balanced, something we haven't seen in a long time, which is really scary for how good their offense can be.
One reason I spoke earlier on today's show about why I cast doubt on the Georgia-Texas matchup, both teams have really tough schedules. Yeah. You look at Georgia's schedule and Texas' schedule, two of the 3 or 4 toughest in the entire SEC. Which team you feel like is more capable of navigating that slate?
I think it's hard to bet against Georgia just because of how they recruit. And really, I said this yesterday, when that schedule gets dropped, every team, 15 teams in the SEC, go look, do we have to play Georgia? Georgia doesn't scurry on that day and go, who do we have to play? Like, everybody has to play Georgia. Now, on the Texas side, the reason I maybe lean more towards Georgia on that question is Texas got 3 draft picks at wide receiver they got to replace. 2 of them were 2 of the best in the entire country last year. I think Quinn Ewers is one of the best in the country as well, but you got new pieces on that side of the ball. I will say Sark as being one of the best play callers, the offense and defensive line, the way they've recruited, the size they have, they're going to compete. I mean, they're going to make a deep run on this thing, no doubt. I just think I'd let the 2-time national champions in the last 3 years, take the lead on that one.
You look at the SEC, and you've covered this league for a long time, and now there's a little bit of new buzz this week at SEC Media Days with Texas and Oklahoma. There are a lot of questions about Texas and Oklahoma that go to other schools about playing against them, recruiting against them. What was your initial reaction to Texas and Oklahoma joining the league?
I think it just elevates the tradition, the competitiveness, the talent, the passion of an SEC conference that was already the best in the entire country. So you got 2 amazing places to go to. I still have not been to Norman. That's the one place I'm excited to go see. Yet? I haven't been. I'm excited to go there. I've spent a lot of time in Austin, and we were there a couple weeks ago to kind of kick off this whole thing with Texas. There was like 30,000, 40,000 people there. I mean, it was unbelievable. So they're ready. Excited to get to Oklahoma, but it's 2 programs that are storied, that have tradition, and that immediately are going to compete in this conference, no doubt, in every single sport, let alone football.
They go from the Big 12 to the SEC. I think it's fair to assess that the level of physicality and defense is a step up. How do you think Texas and Oklahoma are preparing to adapt to that sort of transition?
Well, Sark, not that Brent Venables doesn't understand it, he absolutely does, but I think Sark was so pointed at recruiting the offensive and defensive line 2 or 3 years ago, 2 years ago, really starting that process for this moment. Not that he knew or predicted that he was going to be here, but he knew that the line of scrimmage coming from Alabama was the most important thing in the entire country. So coaches that aren't in the SEC, before they come here, they kind of scoff at the idea that, it's so much harder. And look, there's good teams everywhere. The physicality is so underrated because you get beat up at the line of scrimmage every single week, no matter if it's Missouri or Kentucky. Those teams are as physical as anybody at the line of scrimmage. So I think that's what sneaks up on you. I think the added bye week, so each team's going to have 2, is really going to help in extending the livelihood of those guys up front and their bodies, keeping them healthy. But the line of scrimmage is definitely different in this league, and they'll need to adapt to that.
Speaking of scheduling, something that's being pondered, and there was a report from Ross Dellinger that it's going to be considered more after the season, which I think makes a lot of sense to see how the committee views SEC teams and their records in the 12-team playoff era. What do you make of a potential 9-game conference slate for the SEC that currently played 8?
Yeah, I think they have to, and I think it'll happen at some point. Being selfish on my end, being on the broadcasting side, I want one more SEC game, just one more matchup. But I think you're right. Now that the playoff is so expanded, when you have a one-loss SEC team, it didn't matter they only played 8. When it was a college football playoff of 4, they're probably going to make it if they're a champion, right? That's just how it is. Now that there's 12, that strength of schedule and who you play from those spots 9 to 12 are going to be really important because there's going to be a lot of similarities between a lot of those teams that are maybe sitting at 10-2, right? And some have a tough strength of schedule and some don't. So I think that's only exaggerated with the 12 teams now. So I think they'll the SEC will do what's right. Greg Sankey always has the future in his mind. He's always thinking with great foresight. They'll get there, and I hope they get there sooner rather than later.
I asked a member of the college football playoff who led off the remarks earlier today at SEC Media Days about how they're going to balance that strength of schedule, record, and all those factors. And it was kind of a non-answer. It was
always is.
It was.
It always is.
Yeah, it somewhat is. I don't think it's necessarily the wrong mindset, though, to say we're going to consider this, we're also going to consider that, but I do think it has to be team dependent. I was actually kind of pleased to hear that he didn't have a uniform response of, we're going to value this more, we're going to value that more, because this record, like you're not where your record says you are.
Yeah.
You might have a much easier strength of schedule, even within the SEC.
Totally.
Every schedule is different.
Yeah, it's apples and oranges, and I've sat in those mock college football playoff committee meetings. It's really hard. It's harder than you think, and at times, you apply one metric to a group of 2 or 3 teams, and you kind of have to apply another metric to a different group of 2 or 3 teams just based on the context. And I think that's important. One standard is not going to fit across the board, right? I mean, this is a nuanced sport. Every game is different. Every environment is different. Playing on the road at certain places is easier than others, at night versus in the day. I mean, there's so many factors that go into this thing. So the human element is needed, but that also means there's always going to be controversy with that 13, 14, 15 team that ends up getting left out.
I think we could have a 2014 playoff like the FCS.
Let's go. Come on.
You'd still have controversy.
Oh, you would, absolutely.
Yeah, oh, no, I'm not going for the 2014 playoff. I would have to go for a mental hop, skip, and a jump for me to get there. But 2 questions to get you out of here on Jordan. One of them, got to ask you about just, you've been around the SEC a lot. You've gone to different stadiums. You've been all around. Is there a favorite place that you have to go to experience a game day environment? I know there are a lot of great ones, and just so we're clear, just because he picks one doesn't mean he doesn't like your team and your stadium.
But Twitter, X, they never remember that, so
no,
it is what it is. I'm going to give you 2 different answers to that. The day pregame experience, you got to go to the Grove, Oxford. I don't think there's anything like it. And just being a California boy that grew up going to every Pac-10 stadium at the time, now they're not Pac-12 anymore. They're nothing anymore. But it's different. Like, people dress up, there's chandeliers and tents, and it's just, the pageantry is crazy. So that was really fun for a California boy that, yes, played in the SEC, but now since I'm on the other side of it, getting to go and enjoy those things, there's nothing like that. And then Death Valley at night, I think, is so special. Like, it is everything it's cracked up to be. I'll give you an undercover one, though. One of my favorite places at night to go do a game is actually Columbia, South Carolina. Like Sandstorm playing before it gets wild. It's not 100,000 people. Yeah. It's 60-something, but it gets as crazy and as hostile as almost anywhere in the SEC. So that's one place that everyone's like, oh, really, South Carolina? I'm like, no, you got to go to a game at night there. It's different.
That feels like if I asked you the question about the ACC, then the answer might be Virginia Tech. One that kind of flies under the radar. Enter Sandman, great tradition. Lastly, you're a Vanderbilt grad. I know Vanderbilt doesn't have high hopes in football. They've got the lowest win total in the SEC this year.
Kick me while I'm down, but yeah.
Do you have a sense of what to expect from your Commodores this season? Can they go over that 2.5 win total?
I think they can, and there's hope because of the changes they made, right? I mean, Clark Lee's never going to be allowed in Las Cruces, New Mexico again, because he went there, he took their former head coach, he took their offensive coordinator, and he took their starting quarterback, and he ran out of there like a bandit. When I flip on the New Mexico State, Tim Beck and his offense that he's bringing to Vandy, kind of reminds me of what we did in 2011 as we really started to turn that corner, get to our first bowl game before going to back-to-back bowl games. I was not really developed as a passer, and we ran me a lot. I ran 15, 16 times a game, quarterback design runs, finding creative ways to steal yards. Because at Vandy, you're never going to line up against an SEC team and be more talented. That's just the fact. Doesn't mean you can't win. We won 9 games being the less talented team every time we step on an SEC field, but you have to find ways to get creative. And when I look at this offense, it's going in that direction. So, yeah, they're not going to flip the switch and win 6, 7, 8 games next year, but I think this is the start of some momentum and a path to get back to that.
Jordan Rogers, ESPN, SEC Network. Jordan, thanks for the time.
For sure, man.
How ready is Oklahoma for the SEC? That's Jay Smith, newest co-host of Locked On Sooners, joining me here on the show. He was just here at SEC Media Days, missed him by just that much for the segment. But that's why technology is so great, because there's nobody I'd rather ask this question to, Jay. How ready is Oklahoma to go to the SEC and win games immediately?
First and foremost, Spencer, thank you so much for having me. Definitely a pleasure to meet you as well as be there at SEC Media Days. It was awesome. And to answer that question, it's been the question asked the most probably at the Media Days. Everybody's asking and wondering, is Oklahoma ready? They don't really ask about Texas, which is always fascinating, but they're asking, is Oklahoma ready? And I'm going to say yes. I think we are ready to begin winning games. I think we're ready to start competing because there's two metrics to really look at when it comes to teams competing, right? The first thing to look at is going to be the blue chip ratio. That dropped from CBS. They've been keeping track of that since 2013, and it kind of gives them an idea of the teams, usually the 16 teams that's really going to be able to compete for a championship. Oklahoma is in the top 8, 73% blue chip ratio. I'm sorry, 74%. My apologies. I don't want to disrespect us. Guess who's right behind us? Texas. They're 73. So it's either we're 74 and they're 73, or they're 73, we're 72. It's in that range. We're just, we don't have to be exact sometimes, but we're 1% higher than them in the blue chip ratio. That should tell you kind of where we are as far as being prepared. And the other
you could say we are the 1%.
Yeah, there you go. We'll go for it, right? We're the 1% better than them. And to go with that, you have recruiting classes, right? We've had top-tier recruiting classes every year that Venables has been here and a few years before. So because we're recruiting at a very high level and we have a very high blue chip ratio, I sense that we're going to be prepared. All we got to do is execute on the field.
Yeah, I look at where Oklahoma was a season ago, and I thought their defense made some just massive strides from the first year. I thought that goal line stand against Texas was the defining moment of the Brent Venables era to this point. And of course, that win is the biggest win that he has had to date as Oklahoma's head coach. I think it's a fair question to ask. Oklahoma fans might be tired of hearing it, but you heard Jordan Rodgers, who's covered the SEC for a long time, earlier on today's show, talk about how when you go to the SEC, it is a step up because you have guys that are not just bigger oftentimes or stronger. They have a greater combination of all these athletic traits. You can call it SEC bias all you like. I've said for a long time, Jay, two things about SEC bias. One, it is very real. You are not imagining things. SEC bias is 100% real. Number two, it's 100% deserved. How else do you react to the conference that has the highest rate of recruits, that has the most NFL draft picks, that wins the most championships? Of course, that's a fair question to ask for teams coming from the Big 12, which typically plays a different style of football across the board. So let's go elsewhere. In the trenches, feels like Oklahoma will be solid at least. But what about the rest of the positions? How ready do you think Jackson Arnold is to take on the SEC?
Yeah, let's start with him at quarterback, right? So Jackson Arnold, 5-star plus quarterback. So every single recruiting site made him a 5-star. Coming out of Denton Guyer, just north of where you are currently in the Dallas Metroplex. And, Gatorade National Player of the Year. He's gotten all these accolades and awards. He did well. He's Elite 11 MVP. I mean, you name it, he's kind of won it. Now, do those things really define success? Not really, right? We've seen the list of last Elite 11 winners as well as National Gatorade Player of Years, and it's a hit and miss type setup, right? It all depends on if you're set up for success at the team you go to, right? Jackson Arnold, I believe, will be fine. He's being forged in fire, which is fantastic for him. And you mentioned this before, Brent Venables' defense, we've seen the growth year after year underneath him. This is a similar trajectory that he had in his first stint at Oklahoma, as well as his stint at Clemson. Within the first 3 years, that defense flew in the top 5. And that's exactly top 5 to top 10, right? I think Oklahoma was top 10, Clemson was top 5, and that's how he trajects right now, right? We moved into the 50s, into the 20s and 30s as far as efficiencies go, and now we're pushing ourselves. We should have a top 10 defense this year. There's no excuse for it. Mainly because in the SEC, offenses aren't very proficient outside of like Alabama when they were doing things, and LSU when they had that absurd
I've seen Tennessee
season.
score a few points here and there. Ole Miss moves the ball up and down the field pretty well.
Ole Miss does now with the Lane train, but I'm talking about, and that's in the last couple of years. I'm talking about it kind of historically, right? That's kind of the thing that made Alabama jump out, especially when they brought in Lane Kiffin and Steve Sarkisian, offensive coordinators. They changed the game, and their offenses got ridiculous. Before, it was run it down their throat and just pound them, pound, nonstop. Then they opened it up. That's when you start to see the influence of the Big 12. Some of the Big 12 offensive coaches started shifting over. Saw Mike Leach, rest in peace, went over to Mississippi State, putting up numbers. Lane Kiffin comes from underneath the Norm Chow tree. That was a lot of high-octane offenses. And so Same thing with Sarkisian. And so Saban saw the writing on the wall, so he made those adjustments. But for the most part, a lot of teams in the SEC don't do that outside of like a Tennessee, historically, because even talking to the Auburn guys, it's always funny. They made mention of, it's like they've had 3,000-yard passers in the school's history. I think we've had maybe 2 players not throw for 3,000 yards in the last 20 years. So every year we're numbers guys. We're
that's a Big 12 SEC difference at some level.
Right. Exactly. Right. And you're starting to see that shift around the country too, right? That's kind of becoming the thing. NFL is the exact same way, right? It's all about offensive-minded guys leading the way and just throwing up numbers. But we have a defensive-minded coach where his focus is stopping offenses like that. And being that we're now in the 3rd year of his system and a lot of the players have returned, 86% of his production is back, the entire goal is for him to put himself in a position for a top defense. So Jackson Arnold himself as quarterback, he'll be fine. He's being forged in fire. He's going against one of the best defenses in the country. Phil Steele lists our linebacker room as well as our safety room as the number 2 rooms in college football. Number 1 in the SEC, number 2 in college football. So we have second best secondary, second best linebacker group, and it's all because of how many veterans are on there, right? With Danny Stutzman leading the way, and then Billy Bowman in the secondary. You got Willie Washington coming back. Gentry Williams had a fantastic breakout year last season. Bringing in a transfer like Des Malone from San Diego State, who started 2 seasons there, who's very good in the zone, especially at like 6'1", 6'2", running almost a 4.5 40. Oklahoma's building that part. Now, the trenches is where the questions lie, right? I don't have concerns. I have questions. Size-wise, we're getting there. We have about 6 dudes over 295 pounds, 3 dudes over 300 pounds right now on the defensive line, especially at the tackle spot. That's critical in the SEC. You don't want to have one dude at 300 pounds playing all the time because he ain't going to make it. Not through a grueling conference where you're dealing with 300-pound offensive linemen all the time, right? Offensive line-wise, everybody on our offensive line is over 300 pounds minimum, and most of our guards are 310 pounds plus. So we've got size. We ain't got Alabama size.
Right.
That kind of felt like a problem for them last year, if you really think about it.
So I want to make sure we have time to wrap up today's show to talk about the Texas game, because I mentioned that earlier on today's show as maybe the game that will define whether or not Texas plays for the SEC championship. I'm just so very bullish on Georgia, and I don't think that Georgia and Texas are going to match up in the SEC championship game. It's possible. It's just they'd have to go combined probably 5-1, maybe 4-2 across 6 games that are exceedingly difficult, and one of them, of course, is against each other. How capable is Oklahoma of beating Texas again? Because I think a lot of people look, it feels with the way these two teams get discussed, like Oklahoma hasn't beaten Texas in 5 years, and yet they beat them just, a season ago.
Right, and Oklahoma's 5-6 in the last 6 games, right? 7 of the last 13. I mean, we can go back all the way to the last 20 years. Oklahoma's owned this series, right? But just in the Sarkisian era, Steve Sarkisian is 1-2 against Oklahoma since he's been there at Texas. And this year's game is going to be probably the most critical one. Like last year for Oklahoma, it was very critical because, Venables needed to really plant himself here. Well, now this year's, the big problem for Texas is that not only do they get Oklahoma, they got Georgia right after them at home. That's going to be a grueling 2-game setup. Now, granted, they have a bye week before Oklahoma, just like Oklahoma has a bye week before Texas. But, man, imagine the physicality in that game. Last year, if you watched the game, Oklahoma was pushing Texas around the entire game. Texas was able to do that to Alabama, right? That should tell you what the trench work, and that should tell you kind of, how good the defense can be for Oklahoma. We could have won that game by double digits. We made the mistake of giving up a defensive touchdown where they blocked the punt in the back of the end zone because, unfortunately, our offensive coordinator made some decisions that were always questionable at that part of the field, right? Well, because of that, you still won the game 34-30, but we led the entire game up until the end of the fourth quarter, and then we made the game-winning drive to close it out. That should tell you kind of what we expect this coming season. Oklahoma has it in their mind. It's obvious. We care about that game way more than Texas does, and our goal is to make sure we become the spoiler for them.
Well, I think Texas might push back on the notion that Oklahoma cares even more because Well, that's what rivalries are all about. I care more.
Exactly.
No, you care more. We're better. No, we're better than you, and such. That's what July is for, and that is Jay Smith. Locked On Sooners. Check him out. Jay, appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me, Spencer.
Appreciate everyone listening. I'll see you next time, and until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.